Hi, good people. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. This is your host, Chris Capola, and I am joined by, as I think Kai called it, the whole crew. So, in order of seniority, Dylan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Still waiting on the Discord to give me a catchphrase, but I'm here, everybody.
Ooh, we need to start a poll. We need
I
to
think so. I
and,
mean, we
and by
said
the way,
that before, and we don't really have options yet because nobody has given us anything. But we can
by the
come
way,
up with some and make it a poll. I don't know.
Dylan, come up with some options. You don't want me involved in this process. I'm telling you that right now.
I mean, yeah, it is Bodie McBoatface all over again if you allow Chris to do it. So
Shouldn't
We'll see
your
what we can
shouldn't
find.
shouldn't your catchphrase though come from you and not
it
be poll
should.
tested?
I
That
don't
feels a
know.
little
I feel like
Clintonian.
catchphrases can be kind of like nicknames where if you come up with it yourself, just to me, I don't know. It doesn't feel quite right.
Well,
We'll
you
see.
gotta Joseph Goebbels that crap. You gotta repeat it often enough to where it just becomes reality.
I find it ironic that he's telling the guy with the German last name to Joseph Goebbels that crap.
That is an irony. Yeah.
We are already so off the rails, and we haven't even gotten through the introductions yet.
Yeah, we're the engine's laying at the bottom of my car right now. That's gonna make sense when we actually get to talking about the topic.
Oh man.
Evan,
Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
and then Kai, if you don't.
Hello. It's good to be back for another episode. And I just want to comment, Chris, you said that I called it the whole crew, which is true. But I think for this episode, just to do a little bit of foreshadowing, we might want to call it the Tetrapartite Pact.
Yeah, ooh, yes, true. We very much might want to. Anyway, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
So to explain my joke about we're being so far off the rails, we're at the bottom of my collar right now. This episode is going to be talking a lot about railroads in Eastern Asia, and it's going to look at kind of the rise of Japan and Russian expansion. Yeah, go ahead and take it away, Evan.
Yeah. Well, so while you said that, we're talking about like East Asian railroads. I just had the most random flashback to, because that seems like an enthralling episode, right? Oh yeah, Siberian railways. Awesome. It gives me the same vibes.
You're not being ironic, by the way.
Oh yeah, no, I am being absolutely I am an Eastern Asian Siberian train enthusiast.
Aren't we all?
Aren't we all? I mean, yeah, that's literally how to get the ladies lining up out the door is just tell them about the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Kind of like Richard Nixon ruining dates because he would tell his dates about what would have happened if Persia had conquered Greece.
Somehow I knew you were going to bring that up.
Oh,
I
100%. Of course.
love that meme. I love
Yes.
it.
It's amazing. It's top tier. I just sent that one to my girlfriend the other day, and she thought it was hilarious. She's like, "Yep, that's you." But no, what I'm thinking about is everybody's favorite. If you're a Venezuelan bus enthusiast, well, I have the video game for you. It's called Crazy Bus on the Sega Genesis. Yeah.
Wait. Venezuelan bus enthusiast? Is
Yeah.
this like Maduro? Like, this is literally Maduro's backstory.
It's Nicholas Maduro origins. Yeah.
Maduro
Exactly.
DLC.
Extra Maduro DLC. Yeah, exactly. But anyway, I better get onto this actual script that I've written, or else we are never gonna get even past go and collect $200 here. So, this is the topic we're going to be talking about is one that we have quite literally talked about, mulled over, chewed on for over 3 months, I think, in various forms or another. It's a big topic. And with a topic such as this, I figured that I would bring back a feature that has been gone from the Fork in Time podcast for some time. And that is the grand opening monologue. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Evan, you tend to grandstand already enough as is when you do intro duties for the topic. Oh, no, you do not know what I have in store for you, dear listeners. I have written a solo monologue That is 5 full pages on my Google Doc here, with a little bit of change on page 6. So, before I begin, I would like to inform our audience that none of the following was assisted or written by the use of artificial intelligence. While I sometimes like to use AI to bounce around ideas for the show, things that like I've maybe already cooked up or developed in my head, I do my absolute best to eschew its use in the creation of content itself. As I mentioned, it's the first time in a while that we've had an opening monologue like this on the show, written a bit more like a story. And we were talking about this beforehand. One of the Erics, it was Eric Darling. What's his last name? Eric Darling Bond. Yeah. He shout outs to him for the concept and the idea, for having some sort of fun little opening monologue like this. I do not have any multiple choice questions for the panel, though. I kind of like a little game show that he used to do. He was very involved in theater and those kind of things, and brought his unique perspective on history into his opening monologues. So my monologue may be a little bit more boring. I did try to throw some humor in here, but maybe next time, if there is going to be a next time. I feel like after I'm done with this monologue, I will probably be given DOS mute button by the Central Chris Committee government. So as much as I've listened to the podcast backlog for a topic as grand and far-reaching of implications as this, I thought a Bondian-like setup would work well. Without further ado, let's get right into it. The year is 1895. It has been 28 years since the Emperor of Japan, Mutsuhito, it would be helpful if I ran through my pronunciations before I started this monologue, who we know today as Emperor Meiji, has ascended to the throne. Commodore Perry's massive, threatening warships in 1854 were a huge reality check for the formerly reclusive Japanese. They had seen how far behind they had fallen compared to the powerful industrial nations of the West. Fearing irrelevance and seeing the impending fate of the fading Qing dynasty in China, especially during the Opium Wars, Mutsuhito rapidly got to work. He abolished the feckless Tokugawa shogunate, fights against Tom Cruise in the totally true events of The Last Samurai, adopted Western customs, and begins an audacious modernization campaign for his feudal hermit country. By the 1890s, Japan had transformed itself into a modern, industrialized, burgeoning empire, and had its sights set on increasing its power and influence in the region. The Japanese wished to be finally respected on the world stage and be seen as equal in power to the West. This, however, did not come without its problems or complications. In the ever-evolving geopolitical soap opera known as the lead-up to the Great War, also known as World War I, the eventual battle lines were drawn primarily due to competing colonial interests among European powers. This was, of course, not limited to Europe. Africa and China also became hotspots. The Japanese, meanwhile, as they sought to be taken more seriously, were another wrinkle in the grand geopolitical intrigue leading up to the Great War. So, how did our newly ascendant Japanese empire seek to gain respect? Well, why not pick a fight with a declining nearby neighbor, all while realizing long-held imperial ambitions in the neighborhood? I am, of course, speaking about the Korean Peninsula. Said declining nearby neighbor, the Qing dynasty, happens to still nominally control the area. For those listeners who are astute students of history, you, of course, already knew who I was talking about, the declining Qing dynasty of China. The Qing still nominally controlled Korea up until this point, but a restless, increasingly cocky Japanese population, raised with a warrior samurai ethos, was anxious for the Japanese government to flex its muscle on the world stage. And flex it, they did. It was no secret to pretty much anybody paying attention that the Japanese sought to influence and eventually control Korea for themselves. Thus, the Japanese triumphed and resoundingly defeated the Qing in the First Sino-Japanese War. Japan's modern military prowess was no match for the Qing. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed April 17, 1895, brought a swift end to the war and ceded the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur to Japan. This alarmed the Russian Empire. Port Arthur, which was, as Dylan noted in the pre-podcast, named after a British military official when the British were never actually involved in this area, weirdly enough, was hugely strategically and economically important to them. It was one of two ports, the other being Weihai, that controlled seaward approaches to the Qing capital, Peking, which is now, of course, modern-day Beijing. Port Arthur falling into Japanese hands would undermine Russia's own desperate, eternal need for a warm water port in the east. Of course, as a side note, Russia taking over a ton of land in Manchuria in the late 1850s and early 1860s wasn't really quite the solution here. Vladivostok just isn't going to cut it as a warm water port. Thus, in our timeline, Russia pressured two other European powers, the Germans and the French, to diplomatically force the Japanese to relinquish control of the area and give it back to the Qing dynasty. This was known as the Triple Intervention. This took place April 23rd, 1895, mere days after the Shimonoseki Treaty was signed April 17th. In other words, the ink barely had time to dry before European imperialists decided to get involved. A classic Europe moment. Lest any of our listeners be misled by thoughts of pure intentions on the part of the Russians, oh, trust me, this effort was not born out of any Russian affinity for or love for the Qing. Oh, no. You see, the Russians had their sights set on Port Arthur for themselves. And in our timeline, they ended up obtaining a 25-year lease from the Qing in the area in 1898. The Russians, in our timeline, sought British help for what became the planned Triple Intervention. The British decided against joining when the Russians came a-calling on April 8th, 1895. Excuse me, I pulled a Don Shelley moment there for a second.
When the Russians come calling in 1985, it hits a little different.
I think it hits a little different. Yes, exactly. But it is at this critical moment that the Rosebery administration in Great Britain decides to, from our perspective, diverge from our timeline and make a different choice at a fork in time. Archibald Primrose, known as the 5th Earl of Rosebery, was a British politician who served as Prime Minister for a short amount of time, from March 1894 to June 1895. He was a member of the Liberal Party and succeeded the famous William Gladstone, who he kicked off the very last end of his career. Basically, kind of think of it as like the capstone of his career, a la Joe Biden winning the presidency at the end of his political career. Gladstone started that in 1892, and he decided after his Irish Home Rule bill didn't pass, you know what? I'm out. I'm just going to go retire. I'm 88 years old. I think I deserve a little bit of peace and quiet. So he hands the reins over to Archibald Primrose. The Rosebery government was a shaky minority government, needing support from some Irish rabble-rouser parties to even be able to gain power against a conservative-dominated House of Lords and Parliament. The ruling Liberal Party under the Rosebery administration had to face many risks if they chose to intervene against Japan. In our timeline, they didn't really see it worth undertaking such an action. The Liaodong Peninsula in China mattered very little to British interests in the short term. But in the alternate timeline on A Fork in Time, we're going to ponder the possibility of if the British actually acted rather un-Britishly and decided to be introspective for once. To take a moment to ask themselves, why would the Russians want to kick the Japanese out here? The British would realize that the Russians want to counter Japan to be able to get their own foot in the door in China. The Brits in our timeline, or the alternate timeline, are going to see through the Russian ruse and recognize that the Russians are, in fact, a great threat to their own interests. The Russians already took Manchuria. What's to stop them from going even further? And the British are also going to realize that Japan is a growing power in its own right. Therefore, the British decide that they do not want to give too much credence to either Japan or Russia. Now, those of our listeners, astute historians, might assume that Britain and Japan were super buddy-buddy for a while here. The 1902 alliance between these two nations, well, doesn't that prove that? Well, that's actually not quite the case with this particular point in history. Britain, sure, wanted a strong Japan and broadly supported their modernization because it helps themselves economically and also blunts the influence of other great powers in the region. But Britain can see how Japan getting too powerful too quick could end up displacing their own interests in the end. Japan in the 1890s also had some degree of suspicion for the British as well. In fact, at this juncture in history, the Japanese were much more closely watching what the British were actually going to do with the Triple Intervention, and not even the Germans. Hence, why the Japanese did not anticipate and were taken by surprise when the Germans ended up joining Russia and France in the Triple Intervention. Not to mention, quite frankly, the British people kind of always like to do British things and see themselves as superior to the Asian peoples that they are seeking to subjugate. And quite frankly, they would rather carve up China amongst European powers as opposed to allowing the upstart ascendant Japanese empire to have a foot in the door. Rosebery himself was a proponent of a strong British empire and favored imperialism and military expansionism, particularly in their famed naval strength. Ergo, the British decide it is finally time to get off the sidelines and to try and regain lost ground in China. In the alternate timeline here, they're going to uneasily join the Triple Intervention in 1895, which we will now refer to as the Quadruple Intervention, despite their reservations about upsetting the Japanese or inadvertently giving their rivals more sway in the region. They're going to craft an agreement that is not quite as explicitly pro-Russian as what ends up happening in our timeline. So here's the best part of the episode, everyone. I get to talk about the specific portions and stipulations in international treaties. Oh, thrilling work. So rather than give the territory to the Qing exclusively, the British, again, do a very British thing and negotiate a key concession. They will help administer and oversee the transition of the territory back to Qing hands over a 5-year lease period, all while giving free and open trade to all parties involved. This satisfies the Qing, since they don't get their butts handed to them and kicked quite as hard. They can focus on licking their wounds from the Sino-Japanese War while outsourcing administration of a territory they were about to lose anyway to the British. This also satisfies Russian concerns about the Japanese taking over this territory, and it gives the Russians what they have been craving for centuries, access to a warm water port. This satisfies German and French concerns, too, about Japan gaining too much ground in the region. And this also satisfies Japanese concerns about ticking off the great powers. Japan knew that they could probably fight and wallop Russia on their own, but they did not want to fight 3 European countries at the same time. And they really did not want to upset the British either, despite their suspicions. So, the ruling Liberal Rosebery administration in Britain, on shaky ground, and facing an election in June 1895, sees this as a way to score a foreign policy victory before the election comes up. They wisely see this as an opportunity for Britain to still keep itself involved enough to ensure that other great powers do not gain too much of an upper hand in the region, even if, on the face of it, this particular region doesn't matter too much to them. Rosebery actually has something now that he can take back to Parliament and say, look, guys, I'm accomplishing something good here. We were able to stop the Russians, and we were able to stop the Japanese. Now, it may sound a little far-fetched at first. Why would the British want to join in on the side of their enemies, the Russians, the Germans, and their historical foes in the French? Aren't we making a change with the full benefit of historical hindsight in mind? I'll admit, yeah, there's a little bit of historical hindsight taking place here. But I still believe there is a way for the British to realize what was happening on a grand realpolitik scale, and plan accordingly with domestic considerations in mind. When you really think about it, this does make a decent amount of sense. So, to conclude my monologue and the setup of the alternate timeline, I'm going to quote a couple of paragraphs of an article about how Britain tried to navigate this issue in our timeline, which we will link to in the show notes. I believe that this will provide ample fodder for the changes that were made in the alternate timeline here. Quote, the Russian government contacted the British about whether it would be interested in making a joint intervention in case the Japanese requested the cessation of Liaodong, but the latter rejected this offer on the 8th of April. The ministers of the Rosebery administration were strongly criticized for this inaction after the Liberals were defeated in the general election of June 1895. They were accused by the conservatives of allowing Russia, France, and Germany to gain the Qing's favor by winning the retrocession of Liaodong on the latter's behalf, whereas the British chose to stay aloof and therefore ended up falling behind in terms of influence in Beijing. It should be noted that this, to some extent, was a diversion from the long-term trend of British East Asian policy, which was to act in accordance with other great powers. The government had hitherto placed significant importance on acting together with the other Western nations, not only because it could project only a limited amount of influence in East Asia on its own, but also to keep the others in check and not to let them gain exclusive privileges, which were not given to Britain. It was also in this light that the British decision not to join the multinational intervention was scrutinized after the war. End quote. To conclude, dear listeners, the British end up making a choice that is more consistent with their already long-held East Asian policies because of one of the single greatest motivators known to man, wanting to hold on to political power. Russia anticipates Japan taking over the Liaodong Peninsula as the Qing and Japanese warring sides begin peace negotiations. Russia reached out to Britain on April 8, 1895, to see if the British would join in their efforts to curb the Japanese takeover. This time, in the alternate timeline, a keener Rosebery government accepts, fearing Britain losing out to the other great powers, or from the British people's perspective, racially inferior people. And yeah, that is a big oof, but we're talking about history and we are talking about historical realities. From their point of view, racially inferior people gaining too much prominence, and due to their seeking a win before the June 1895 election. The Shimonoseki Treaty, ending the Sino-Japanese War, is signed April 17th, giving the peninsula to Japan as feared. So, Britain ends up joining the now quadruple intervention and negotiates British oversight of the territory for 5 years under a similar pretext for the triple intervention from our timeline of preventing instability and war. This agreement pleases all sides involved, and as we will end up discussing, likely delays or possibly prevents the Russo-Japanese War altogether. I now leave this up to the debate, interpretation, and commentary of my brilliant co-hosts. You will probably not hear too much from me moving forward. I have likely exhausted all of your collective eardrums by the sound of my voice at this point. So, gentlemen, what do you have to say about this Bondian monologue?
What's the name of the Russian port in the Far East?
Vladivostok. I probably mispronounced it.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to let you keep going.
No, and here's the thing. Like I said, I need to figure out my pronunciations before I read a almost 6-page document.
I mean, to be fair, this is probably one of the gonna be a bad pronunciation episode, just because there are. Okay,
there's Russian, there's Japanese, there's Chinese.
None of us are gonna mess up Port Arthur. That's about the only place named safe.
Exactly. I mean, hey, our Eurocentric, WASP selection of co-hosts here.
Don't you dare call me a wasp.
Okay, all right. I don't want to trigger Chris any more than he has already been triggered. And we haven't even really started the full discussion on the episode. But
3 wasps and an Italian walk into a bar. I'm assuming based off your last name, Chris, that you're of Italian ancestry.
Oh yeah.
Perhaps mistakenly. Okay,
good. Yes. Anyway, gentlemen, I'm just going to probably be like ducking in here and out, giving some maybe devil's advocacy or stuff, but I just wanted to set that up. I feel good. I feel relieved getting that all off my chest. Take it from here, gents.
Well, I think maybe it would be helpful to hone in on Evan's last statement, which we talked about in the pre-discussion. For anyone doing bingo, there's your stamp for that one. In the pre-discussion, we talked about whether the proposed fork that Evan so beautifully elocuted for us would actually be effective in preventing the Russo-Japanese War, or whether it would simply delay things 5, 10, however many years to be debated. I contended that it would not be the case that this would prevent the Russo-Japanese War. It would merely delay at best, or perhaps change the nature of the Russo-Japanese War, because what we're talking about here is Port Arthur, which is indeed a very important part of the Russo-Japanese War. Who controls it is of great importance. But especially from Japan's perspective, there are other quote-unquote casus belli, causes for war, one of which is broader Manchuria, and the other of which is Korea. Neither of which are explicitly dealt with in this tetrapartite quadruple pact treaty, that whatever it is that we're going to call it. So it begs the question, is Port Arthur being more or less dealt with, so to speak, in this alternate timeline? Is that enough to delay Japanese aggression? And if so, for how long? Or does it simply give Japan a different reason to go to war, but they're still going to go to war because they want to take over broader Manchuria, they want to take over Korea, even if Port Arthur is not necessarily on the table at this time? What do you guys think?
Well, I think one of the big things that this change does that also is immediately going to have some knock-on effects is if the Brits are involved in the now quadruple intervention, that then drastically changes the analysis for both sides, Britain and Japan, a little bit later down the road in 1902. I think in a situation like this, the Brits and the Japanese either would not sign the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, or it would be not an alliance so much as some kind of minor trade agreement, because the Brits have been helping Japan modernize their industry and their sort of economy, but there's not going to be any kind of military or diplomatic components to it. The reason why that is kind of important is because this era of British history is it's the tail end of sort of the great games of colonialism. This is the end of the sort of classical Victorian era and Britain's so-called splendid isolation. In our timeline, one of the things that sets up the alliances that lead into sort of Britain's position in World War I with the Entente Cordiale and some of the other stuff is when the Brits sign this Anglo-Japanese alliance. This is the first peacetime treaty that they've signed. So it kind of represents a cracking of this, British self sense of kind of standing above and apart and independent from the rest of the nations of the world. They're like the S tier and everybody else is A tier below.
Yeah, we're basically better than all of you.
Exactly. So this is an interesting change because without this alliance that Britain signs with Japan, what does that do to later, evolutions of British foreign policy? I do think since Britain is instead joining the quadruple intervention, there's going to be some kind of corollary in terms of this is probably a similar event to the kind of cracking of the splendid isolation. But I do think Japan's perception is very much going to be one of, okay, we don't have any friends among the European powers.
Yeah,
we are truly on our own in terms of having anyone else in our neck of the woods who has anywhere kind of remotely parallel or compatible interests with us. It is going to be much more of a sense for Japan of us against the world with no friends.
Exactly. And that's kind of the reason why I brought that up to begin with, is because, sure, we have the Port Arthur diplomatic situation more or less resolved. What we do not satiate in any capacity is Japan's desire to be an imperial power.
Yeah.
the resolution of the Port Arthur affair is not going to satiate Japan still has the lingering hunger for territory and to become an imperial power that can rival a Western power. And so fighting Russia is merely a means to an end of gaining territory outside of the mainland. Port Arthur is, of course, it's just a port. It's not actually a large swath of territory. So Japan is still going to have that lingering hunger. At the same time, I think with Britain having this sort of contract with Port Arthur that allows them to have an administrative presence in the region, they're going to be more or less ambivalent to the idea of Japan seizing what they see as extraneous territory on the periphery. And so they're not going to have too much of an incentive to intervene in that context. So I'm just curious to see, do we see Japan in this alternate timeline seek to obtain territory elsewhere, or by some diplomatic, political, geopolitical means is Japan staved off for a certain period of time? And if so, why? What do you guys think?
So I'm inclined to say six of one, half a dozen of the other, as the old saying goes. I do think so. So with a British presence in Port Arthur, that brings a significant tactical concern that Japan is immediately going to have to recalculate any future endeavors around, and that is the Royal Navy. Which obviously, even if not all of it is going to be spontaneously showing up in Port Arthur, the Brits can basically send whatever ships wherever they want. So that's a tactical rebutment that Japan is going to have to, at the very least, redraw some plans around. But at the same time, this is going to be kind of the northern, like you said, the Brits they're at least ostensibly in charge of overseeing the transition of Port Arthur. They don't have any wider territorial ambitions in the region. In point of fact, all of their territorial ambitions for China are further south along the coast, and especially once you get into kind of more directly south of this, and like Taiwan and Hong Kong and kind of that area. So I think on the one hand, Japan is going to have to figure out what a British presence means in terms of what they might have to worry about, but they're going to recognize that the Brits are probably, as long as they don't attack them directly or make any too aggressive moves, they're going to at least have some leeway to maneuver around, particularly in the stuff that's close to Korea and, in Manchuria. But I do think they're going to at least feel some increased delicacy around some of that. So I think it's more going to be, there's going to be some delays, and they're going to be a little bit more delicate, at least with diplomatic overtures before they try and pull anything in the future. At least
Chris, what do you think?
I'm interested to think about kind of moving it a little bit forward to something we hinted at, which is, how does this affect the Boxer Rebellion?
I was actually going to say that technically moves things a little back, because we're talking like 1902 time frame with the alliance with Japan and Britain, that obviously being scuttled. That's changed in our alternate timeline. But Boxer Rebellion is like 1899, 1900-ish, I think. So yeah, that's what I was thinking too, Chris. So take it from there.
So in our timeline, basically, I believe it's called the Boxer Rebellion because the technical name of the rebel group was the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. And people understood that as boxers.
One of the best names for like a rebel group ever created. Like, it's so awesome.
Negative. Nothing to do with their ideology, just based solely on the name. I'm just going to drop this and then keep moving. The Moro Islamic Liberation Front. All right. So, in like 1900, they rise up, they kind of attack and besiege and it is the European quarter of Beijing, which is very close, relatively close, especially considering to the Liaodong Peninsula, especially considering that, like, at this point, again, no Western concessions have really gotten close to Beijing. They have kind of been focused in Nanjing in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in southern China. So first and foremost, I think the British are going to see having Port Arthur as a very convenient jumping off point to the Western intervention that marches into Beijing and relieves the international quarter. That changes that intervention. The other thing it does in our timeline is this is kind of when Russia comes in and starts laying claim to Manchuria. Does that still happen with the British right there? And also, is this kind of a trade-off of there's kind of a more formalized recognition of Japanese claims in the Korean peninsula in exchange for the Russians in Manchuria, and Britain kind of keeping up. All Britain needs is a little bit of a port and they're happy, because that still means they have a presence in the area. And do they still balance these? How do they manage those two competing claims? Do they try and keep everybody status quo out of the area, or do they kind of trade off, recognize some Japanese interest in Korea, recognize some Russian interest in Manchuria?
So I think from the British perspective, they certainly will try to recognize that. I think from the Russian and Japanese perspectives is where you're going to run into the problems of official recognition. Because obviously Russia is going to want as much of Manchuria as they can claim, which is going to include stretching as much as they can do it into kind of northern Korean peninsula. Japan's going to be vice versa. And that is one of the other interesting things about the Anglo-Japanese treaty, is because it expressly lays out between Britain and Japan a recognition that Japan has Korea in its sphere of influence, and Britain can, as regards the four corners of the treaty, Britain has China in its sphere of influence, notwithstanding the fact that, there's Germans and some Frenchmen and some other people there too. So that's an official thing that's in that document, but without that document, Britain is going to be trying to make these maneuvers, but I think it's going to be much more of soft power, because it knows that the Japanese and the Russians are probably, especially on Nicholas II's side after the whole the tour to Japan thing, they are never going to see eye to eye in terms of a formal treaty that is going to recognize boundaries over this stuff. So I think Britain's going to recognize there's always going to be a sort of Balkan-esque powder keg here. How can we just keep it on a low enough simmer that we don't have it explode?
Yeah. And I think something to think about as well is that, in the alternate timeline, the British are going to be perceived and seen much more, not so much in terms of their own interests, although that is like the reason they end up doing the quadruple intervention as I set up in this timeline, but they're going to be seen as like a little bit of a referee for kind of putting the thumb on the scale a little bit for European interests. Because like in our timeline, they become friends with Japan fairly quickly after this point in time, especially with what happens with the Boxer Rebellion, where you basically have 8 countries, including Japan and Russia and Germany and France. So all of these guys who they have their own Balkanization claims, they have all of these crazy things going on between them, but they basically all agree that this righteous society of harmonious fists, or whatever they're called, they got to go. And the Qing dynasty, which is also at a certain point starting to prop them up because they're like last gasp at, being able to reclaim the glory days of ancient China. They basically just all decide to dogpile. Like they hit the change teams button in Counter-Strike and all decide to just team up against the Qing and like obliterate them and the Boxers. Yeah, not a pretty sight. So I think that still happens.
Well, by the way,
largely how it does.
I don't think they team up against the Qing Empire. They team up against the Boxers who were rebelling against the Qing. And the Europeans are like, okay, Qing, kind of like Turkey, please stay here so that we don't wind up killing each other over like dividing up the
Yeah.
country.
Yeah, I think there's a
exactly.
recognition of this is going to be still going to be sort of the Chinese century of humiliation, because the foreign powers are going to recognize we want to beat up the rebels because we want to keep you because you are too easy to take advantage of.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so I think, Boxer Rebellion probably still pans out a lot how it does. But I think the question of the aftermath after that and, what the terms are, Japan is still going to be upset with Britain. Japan is going to definitely see Britain, and as we set up earlier, all of these European powers as, okay, it's us versus them. Maybe we can try playing some off of each other. Maybe we, something like that. But I think even Japan at this point, even though they're ascendant, they haven't yet proven themselves against the European powers, and they know that they can't fight against all of them. So I think the factors that end up leading to the Russo-Japanese War in our timeline are still largely present, but just the realpolitik reality of we can't get Germany and Russia and France and Great Britain fighting us all at the same time. That's a game changer. That's game over. In our timeline, Japan saw it as just, us versus Russia, and that's way easier to deal with.
I think the key here is understanding the British role.
Yeah.
The reason the Germans and French and Americans and Italians and everyone else was able to participate in the relief of Beijing, the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, is because of basically acquiescence of Great Britain. Great Britain is still at the point where their national policy is our Navy has to be the size of the next two national navies. And if you look at a map, you basically have to turn the globe to find Germany and Italy and Britain and France and the United States if you're actually looking at the area we're talking about. What that means is if the British Navy is preventing you from doing something, you basically can't play in East Asia. Unless you're Russian and have a land border. So that's why it's so the British-Japanese relationship is so key here. Do they want to be fighting all those other countries? No. Those other countries can't actually do anything if Britain stops them.
Yeah. And so I think one of the other things that having this does, just to kind of set up eventual down the road, is this also changes from the Japanese perspective. Like I said, it's them against the world. But what I mean by that is it removes kind of the beginnings of the nudge that eventually leads Japan to formally side with, in reality, kind of just more lean towards the Allies in World War I. So I think the practical outcome of this Japanese us against the world mentality that's going to come up out of this is they're going to be playing a much more realpolitik, trying to watch the French and the British and the Germans and the Russian, less the Russians. They're going to be trying to figure out an excuse to fight them. But the other three, the French, the Germans, the British, they're going to be watching them in China and trying to play them off of each other, because this is right at the end of the Meiji Restoration and into the period beyond that. So they are almost, not entirely, but almost done with their industrial and economic reformation and basically jumpstart with a nuclear battery to get them into an industrial power. But they're going to recognize, okay, we are important enough that the rest of these guys are going to want to have us help out, pitch in, whatever, depending on what goes on, so we can take stuff off of that. But contra to that, the European powers are also going to, if they see Japan start doing that, they're going to have a sense of the Japanese as much more opportunistic, fair weather friend, kind of there's going to be much more ambivalence on both sides from an eventual foreign policy standpoint, where nobody's really going to be sure exactly how much they can trust each other. So everybody is going to kind of be on their own. And what that's going to amount to is all of the other Western powers are going to kind of be sitting on the sidelines watching whatever starts brewing between Russia and Japan. And everybody's just going to kind of sit there, and essentially the European perspective is going to be to like just grab the lawn chairs and get the popcorn in the microwave, because they know something's going to start happening, but they're just going to sit back and get ready to kind of watch and see.
Well, this is a legitimate question that I think we touched on it and want to kind of get to, which is something going to jump off?
That's what I was going to throw in here is, are the Japanese going to try and do something as long as they know that Britain is in the area, has possible naval interests, that they can throw at any time to, because, the British are just going to want to keep the status quo, really, for as much as possible. They're going to try and make everyone happy. They're going to try and, keep things going as far as they can. And so if Japan starts making, rumblings and, beating the war drums, for example, a little bit against Russia, like, I don't think that's something that Britain is gonna want or go for, even though they're not really for Russia. They're also really not for a super ascendant Japanese empire either. So I think as long as the terms of the lease are in effect, it's just gonna kind of be this uneasy sort of, everybody kind of knows what each other wants, and everybody knows that Japan wants more than they're already being given, but Britain's just kind of there to be able to be like, put the kibosh on it and just be like, yeah, no, you're not doing that. You don't want to mess around with us. We can project naval power.
I think one of the things we talked about is in the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion, Britain decides to renegotiate the terms.
That's what I was just getting to. Yes.
To make that a lot more long term.
One thing,
and they have the pretext for it. They have the pretext.
Right. Yeah. One thing that I want to talk about a little bit about, though, is I feel like we're kind of approaching this a little bit with historical hindsight in mind in the way that we're regarding Japan. We're regarding Japan as a respected imperial power. In this alternate timeline, we do not have the Russo-Japanese War happening in the way that it did. And the results of that Russo-Japanese War was a decisive Japanese victory, which, in no uncertain terms, established Japan as a respected imperial power, leading to the other imperial powers and Russia having a newfound respect for Japan, because this is an Asiatic power that is able to topple a Western power. And so we're approaching this from the perspective of, okay, well, everybody agrees Japan is a respected imperial power, without the historical background of Japan defeating a historical power, which then cements itself as an imperial power. So I'm curious if we can somehow justify Japan being treated as a respected imperial power if they haven't actually gone to war with Russia and haven't demonstrated their capabilities of being able to contend with the big boys on the stage in order to be treated like the big boys on the stage. Because as time goes on, Japan is uniquely going to be incorporated in these Western diplomatic overtures. Think Treaty of Versailles, think the League of Nations. I mean, Japan is one of the founding, prominent council members on the League of Nations, the only Eastern power to be respected in that way. And one can very easily conjecture that this is entirely, or at least mostly, because they defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, which in this alternate timeline either does not happen or does not happen at the same time or happens later.
So I agree with what you're saying. I think Great Britain doesn't recognize Japan as a partner in 1902. I don't think there is the kind of the prior recognition, because really it's 1902 and Britain saying, you're an important power and you're our partner over there. The other thing to think about is the effect on Russia.
Yeah, that's the thing I'm kind of thinking of, because this is also a Russia that is post Alexander's reforms, post Crimea, but nobody outside of Russia has a true, really that much of an understanding of what that really means.
And also what are we doing with these reforms? Because basically, like, to kind of take a step back, Russia was resting on its laurels of the Napoleonic Wars. Those got shown up in the Crimean War, and basically, at the very end of that war, new Tsar comes in and says, okay, we're no longer like a first-class power. We need to reform to become that. And he starts a lot of breaking up of the old things and modernization, industrialization. And then he gets killed. And then his son gets killed. And then his grandson takes over, Nicholas II, who's probably not the best Tsar there's ever been. He's a nice romantic character. Like, he probably should just have, like, I don't know, a beach. Turn, like, Tsar Casillo into a beach house and just write letters back and forth, whatever. He's got Tsar material. And basically, one of the things that really happens in our timeline after the Russo-Japanese War is it's another of these moments when everybody has the fact that Russia's a big power, but that can't actually apply it, shoved in their face again. And if you look forward, one of the things that really happens, and not really Nicholas, but like a lot of his major advisors look at this and are like, all right, man, we need to get together again. We need to become a dynamic power again. We need to put in some work in terms of building railroads, because, you know, getting back to kind of our opening joke, the Trans-Siberian Railroad isn't Trans-Siberian yet. It actually stops at Lake Baikal, and like you have to move your stuff.
Get mules and stuff. Yeah.
I thought it was shipping across the lake.
Maybe it was. Yeah.
But
but either way, there's a giant hink in the chain of the Trans-Siberian Railroad.
And but either of those, you have to unload the train, put it on whatever other method, mule or boat.
Yeah. Haul it.
Transship it.
Load it back up.
A period. Pick it back up. And this became very clear in the Russo-Japanese War when they started trying to move their troops over. That doesn't happen. A lot of people, by the way, I have to throw this out there. Great episode. That might be the latest, this year's bingo spot is us talking about one of the other podcasts we love.
Agreed.
Great episode of Lions Led by Donkeys about like how horrible the Russian Navy coming from the Baltic over to try and intervene was. All of these things really show up, like how bad Russia is at war. And that does two things. One, it convinces a lot of people maybe they're not that important. Number two, it convinces a lot of Russians we need to get there because there's the Balkans. We want to be involved in the Balkans. There's Morocco. There's now we've kind of built up this kind of Manchurian powder keg. There's all of these places all over the world, and a big one's coming.
Yeah.
My knee's hurting. I can tell the storm's coming.
I was just about to say, number 3, it convinces a group of sauerkraut-loving people that perhaps a two-front war is feasible.
Exactly. And you get to the situation, not only a two-front war is feasible, but because Russia has been shown so weak, they're weak now, but they know they're weak now, and they're changing it. And if you look at, all of these different crises, Morocco, 1911, 1912, the Balkans, 1913, the Balkans, 1914, the Balkans. Every single time, everybody's looking at Russia and saying they're weak now, but that line's turning around.
There's something going over in them there hills, and we got to take care of it.
And
Well,
we can take them now, but in 3 years and 5 years, we're not going to be able to. So maybe we need to start sending out some blank checks to the Austrians so that we can start the war when we can still win it.
mm-hmm. So I almost wonder if, in thinking more specifically, less about the kind of motivations behind the eventual World War I, but what you said, Chris, is interesting because in this timeline that we're talking about now, say in 1905 and kind of the years after that, when the Russo-Japanese War would have happened, this is a Russia that is still constructing the Trans-Siberian Railway, but without a military conflict, it doesn't have they recognize the infrastructure problem, but it is not a military logistical problem because there are less military logistics to deal with in 1905. I wonder if in a Russo-Japanese War context, because you have these evolving calculations and stuff, what kicks off kind of our version of the Russo-Japanese War is actually not from the Japanese side, but from the Russian side, because everybody kind of sees them and recognizes, oh, these guys are doing these reforms. And so Nicholas, who all the while is getting whispered into his ear by Wilhelm II, talking about how inferior these Asiatic peoples are, maybe Nicholas, because Japan does not have firm diplomatic control over Korea on the other side, maybe Nicholas decides to go on the offensive and have a kind of short, grand promotional war against the Japanese to try and take Korea sometime in the late 1910s, once they can more establish the Trans-Siberian Railway.
So my first thought is these reforms you talked about aren't happening.
That's what I was going to say too. Yeah.
Well, the construction of the Trans-Siberian, I more mean the Crimean reforms, not the 1905 reforms.
Okay.
I'm more talking about the Crimean military reforms, and then also the Trans-Siberian Railroad's been being constructed since the 1890s. So that's happening.
And let's not forget the revolution of 1905, which was kind of the first, communists, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, whatever, starting to make communist noises, isn't happening here either, because the Russo-Japanese War doesn't happen.
Precisely.
So
yes,
it's more of a, the Russians are kind of slowly building infrastructure. There isn't as much of a, because of the incompetence of the Tsar and, the hot mess of Russian bureaucracy, they think it's fine, that everything's okay. All of this is being handled. We're building our little Trans-Siberian Railway. So, Dylan, as much as I would like for that scenario to pan out, I just don't really, frankly, I think the Tsar is too high off of Rasputin's farts to actually want to do anything here.
The other thing is this. Britain's right there. What's Britain? Britain is going to have a say.
Yeah, Britain's always going to have a say.
And I think Britain is making French noises right now. They're not engaging in anything. They're not doing formal alliances. But if Russia goes off the reservation, marches down into Manchuria, and actually picks a fight with Japan, I could conceivably see Britain getting involved in that.
Oh, see, I think Britain would just sit there and relish the fact that two warring powers were there and they're not involved.
Yeah, and I think Britain, I understand why Britain would want to get involved, but I think, like you said, Britain is making French noises. The one firm ally that Russia has right now is the French.
It's the French.
So I think if, on the one hand, if the Russians go half-cocked into Manchuria, that is an offensive war, not a defensive war. But if Britain responds to that, from the Russo-French perspective, that could become a defensive war. And I think if Britain is trying to engage in France, they would rather let the Russians go off half-cocked against what all the Europeans perceive as some inferior Asiatic peoples. This is, from the European perspective, this is just going to be another part of the European great game in Asia.
Yeah.
What I don't think the Brits are going to want to risk is the possibility of entangling France against them when they're trying at the same time to buddy with France against the looming threat of the Germans. So I think as long as Britain can get some guarantees that this will be limited in scope.
Looking at it from this perspective, with what you're talking about, I'm not convinced that Britain pursues these French ties. And I could kind of see a sense of, for the lack of a better phrase, just a throwback to what we were talking about earlier, an alliance of the WASP.
Oh, okay.
I'm kind of seeing where this is going, Chris, because again, we have to remember the British monarchs, right? Where do they come from? I'm just going to give you a hint. It's not Britain.
And
it's a certain sauerkraut loving people.
And you have Fashoda, which is basically a semi-conflict battle in kind of modern day Sudan, Chad area between the British and the French claimants.
Okay, bringing up Sudan and Chad was not in my bingo for this episode.
And so I think I really think it's a possibility that Britain might be, if Russia pushes it, Britain might be okay getting involved in this. And you would have something that looks maybe even a lot like what Winston Churchill wanted to call the First World War, what we Americans call the French and Indian War, and what Europeans call the 7 Years' War.
Yeah, where you have the Anglo-German versus French. That's interesting. So maybe
I think that's fascinating.
So maybe this is just kind of a good way to end the episode to tease, what may eventually be some kind of Russo-Japanese conflict, or could potentially turn into not, kind of a later First World War, or a First World War that starts off with a Balkan powder keg, but maybe this could, depending on if it happens, this could actually turn into an earlier something that turns into not what we understand as the First World War as, Serbian shoots Austrian Archduke, tangling alliances come in essentially all at once, but almost what amounts to kind of a rolling series of conflicts that start daisy chaining into almost an earlier World War One.
That's what I was thinking.
Kind of a lot like the 7 Years' War happened.
Yeah.
Now, it didn't actually start with George Washington, because then it's no longer called the 7 Years' War.
Right.
But kind of what you're talking about there, where it's not a crisis over the course of 3 weeks.
Yeah. It's an evolving, several months, maybe even several years kind of cascade of failures. Okay, that's interesting. And I actually really like that, because we can explore that and sort of whether that would happen and how that would get started in the next part, because I feel like we've been going on long enough. This is a good natural place to kind of put a break. So, listener, spoiler alert, this is a part two. This is going to be a part two. But maybe that's kind of where we'll end it, unless anybody has some final thoughts, and we can kind of tease up that as the kind of good natural starting point for the next part, to where we can get into what that kind of looks like.
Yeah,
I think that's great.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end off. The only thing I'm going to throw in here is we didn't talk a ton about America in this episode. We kind of made some references here and there. This is much more European-centric, Asian-centered episode, which I think makes sense. But the main butterfly effect that I even titled my document on this for the Russo-Japanese War episode is No Nobel for Teddy. And this is, as a little, historical quiz knowledge point, this was the first time that an American president won the Nobel Peace Prize, was Teddy Roosevelt's efforts to negotiate the ending to the Russo-Japanese conflict. So that doesn't happen because there is no Russo-Japanese conflict. Teddy Roosevelt doesn't get a Nobel Peace Prize. And he ends up maybe throwing a fit, not to get too much in modern politics, along the level of a certain sitting U.S. president about not getting a shiny gold medal. No, but he wouldn't, because there wouldn't even be any way for him to be a candidate for that to begin with. But that's just the one knock-on effect that I thought of. And I think for part 2, thinking about how America is going to be seeing all of this in the midst of a very, just American expansionary, imperialistic sort of ambitions of their own. I think that's fascinating, because in our timeline, World War I happens when America is pretty much the opposite, I guess, far away from imperialism, and wanting more of an isolationist stance as humanly possible. I mean, Woodrow Wilson won re-election, again, our favorite president ever on A Fork in Time. He won re-election on what campaign slogan? He kept us out of war. If we fast forward World War I think the Yankees are going to come into play for sure. But that's just my parting thought.
Yeah, I only have one parting thought, and as is my tradition on this podcast, it is completely ridiculous. So it's more something that I'm going to set up for the next part, because that's when the conflict is maybe going to be. But one of the things that I learned in prepping for this episode is, so in talking about Tsar Nicholas, his little tour to Japan, the fact that all the European monarchs are related to each other. So one of the things that Nicholas II was going to do on his kind of grand tour to Japan and the Far East in the late 1890s, when he got attacked by the samurai, he was on his bucket list of things to do while he was there was to get a copy of a dragon tattoo that George V had on his arm, his cousin who later became the King of England. So if you have a conflict between Russia and Japan turn into something that ends up being somehow England on one side and Russia on the other, I'm going to channel famed mystery writer Stieg Larsson and say that war will become known as the War of the Dragon Tattoo.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, I'm like, hey, we're going to get advanced copies. It's not the girl with the dragon tattoo. It's the monarch with the dragon tattoo.
Yeah.
That'd be hilarious.
The Saxe-Coburgs with the dragon tattoo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Having that added to the Saxe-Coburgs coat of arms would be a sight to behold.
Yeah. Ed Hardy t-shirt and a dragon tattoo.
I'm just picturing George V photoshopped wearing Ed Hardy.
Like the Jersey Shore. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we sandwiched this episode in absolute insanity. Started and ended with it, and I love it. Well, everyone, if there's no other parting thoughts, I think I'll just kind of bring us for a landing here. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning into this. As always, we have our Discord open. May or may not do a poll for Dylan's opening phrase or suggestions. We're still open to feedback on that. And I think that's just about it. So, dear listeners, and of course my co-hosts, who will be the only ones who will be able to respond directly to my inquiry, if we happen to stumble across a fork in Port Arthur, or it's Vladivostok? Vladivostok. Okay. If there is a fork at Vladivostok, what, pray tell, do you think we should do with that?
Sign a 5-year lease on it that turns into a 25-year occupation.
Get drunk and wake up with a dragon tattoo.
Invade Manchuria.
There it is.
Love to see it. There it is, folks. Anything but just simply taking it. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.